name is Samuel Clemens, just an ordinary man from Hannibal, Missouri. Now, if you've read any of my silly little stories, you may know me by the name of Mark Twain, which is my pen name. I was born November 30th of 1835, right under Halley's Comet. As soon as I could recognize the importance of this, I knew it was the start of something great. My father, John Clemens, was a lawyer and then a judge, and he even dabbled in banking. Now, as respectable and well-paying as you think these jobs may be, they didn't help us put food on the table. You see, because where I lived at the time, there were very few trials and very few clients for his bank. My mother was a mother of 7 children, quite a few, although only 4 lived past childhood. If you'd asked me in those days what I was interested in, I may have seemed macabre and overinterested in death. Now, this wasn't really my fault, you see, because by that time, at around 11 years old, I'd already seen 2 murders. One of a cattle rancher whom I knew, and the other of a slave struck so hard with an iron that he just collapsed right there where he stood. When I was 12 years old, my father passed away after a bout with consumption, which we now call tuberculosis. I had to drop out of the school which I loved so much after only 5 years and become an apprentice printer. When I was 15 years old, my printing license was fulfilled and I became my own man. Started working for my brother who lived just a little ways out of town, running a newspaper called the Hannibal Journal. I even attempted to be a journalist at this newspaper, but I wasn't very good at it because in those small towns, you see, it's very difficult to talk to people, all slow and not with very many good stories to share. At 17, I knew I had to get out of that town and I ran away. At 18, I moved to work as a printer, first in Cincinnati, then I found myself as a journalist in St. Louis. It was a little easier there because people had more stories to share about the big city. But I knew that my real calling was to become a riverboat pilot, and at 21 years old I apprenticed, and at 23 I was out and my own man. I loved that work so much along the Mississippi River as a riverboat pilot that I told my brother, 14 years old, to become a pilot himself. At 16 he was a pilot. This is how I killed my brother, you see, because on his first day as a pilot, the ship he was working on exploded and he was killed in the ensuing fire. And I knew about it too because a month prior I had seen it coming in a dream, and I didn't warn him. Never really forgave myself for that. But my grief was cut short by the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 when all traffic along the Mississippi stopped, and I had to give up that job which I loved so much of being a riverboat pilot. I even joined a Confederate voluntary militia for about 2 weeks before it disbanded. I was never a fit soldier. I decided that the real adventure was out west, and I went to Nevada where my brother worked. See, the work I did was very tedious. It was the secretary to the secretary to the secretary of the governor of Nevada Territory. It was mostly answering letters for the secretary of the secretary, who was the secretary of Orion, who was the secretary of the governor. There was no adventure in that. There was no fun, no riches. And so I went to California where the gold rush had just begun, and I decided to try my hand at mining. Although I never did strike it rich, I did figure out that journalism in those towns was quite easy, as all the stories were of gold and riches and things that people like to hear about. Plus, San Francisco was not far away, and it was very easy to travel into town, get jobs, and then go out to the mining towns to write down stories. Now, these mining towns led me to write a story called The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. It's a story about our good friend Simon. Simon was the biggest talker that you have ever met. And he told me in no short manner of words that a friend of him named Jim was a betting man. Now Jim had him a frog. And Jim's frog, Jim said, could outjump any frog in Calaveras County. Now one day a con man rolled into town and said, "Jim, if you can catch me any frog out of that pond, I will bet you $100 that he can jump right past your frog." Jim agreed because he needed $100 and he had 100 of his own. Now, when the When Jim wasn't looking, the con man filled Jim's frog so full of buckshot that a little bit dribbled out of his mouth. When the race was begun, Jim's frog couldn't move an inch. Now, this was all told over the course of several minutes by my friend Simon. I barely escaped that conversation by running off to Europe, which I did. See, my newspaper that I worked for had paid me to go through Europe and to the Holy Land, writing travels the whole way, where they would make all the letters into a novel called an epistolary novel. Now, on the trip down from Italy to the Holy Land, I met a man named Charlie Langdon. Charlie was a well-enough fellow, but what really interested me was not his profession or his conversation, but his sister, you see. His sister's name was Olivia, and she's the prettiest thing that you ever did see. Of course, she didn't really want to be married, and it took me 3 tries to get her to marry me. But she agreed in 1870, and she convinced me to work more on my writing career. In 1876, I published my most successful novel, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and it put me in a financial up. 1883, I wrote Life on the Mississippi, which did sell quite well, although it was mainly just descriptions of the river. But in 1884, I sold the novel that really held people captive for hundreds of years, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Now, this story is mainly about Huck and Jim. Now, Huckleberry Finn is a young boy of about 10 years old, uneducated, much like myself a while back. Jim's an escaped slave who he runs with down the river. Now, see, they boat down the river all day and all night for several months until Jim is captured. Now, Huck struggles with Jim being captured because he knows it's what's right in those days for a slave to be sent back to his owner. But he also knows that Jim's his friend and that he should help Jim. Now, this has been debated for many years on how I should have written that story, how I should have written in Huck saving Jim or not saving Jim. This story was written mainly for laughs, as it was simply a sequel to Adventures of Tom Sawyer, but it brought to attention the issues of social class and race. It was banned first in Brooklyn in 1905 because of a racial slur which it uses, although that racial slur was common in the time which it was set. It remains banned in that library and many others to this day. In 1885, I opened a publishing house and gained a majority of my wealth by selling the memoirs of the soon-to-be-deceased Ulysses S. Grant. However, I then made some mistakes with my money and invested in a page typesetting machine which was to outdate the human printer. Of course, it was prone to breakdowns. In the very same year, another investor bought a different company and made it run a little better. The machine that he bought is still used today, whereas mine was only made twice, and one of them was given away for scrap. I decided to take a second trip to the Holy Land and then down to the Mediterranean and write travel letters to create a second epistolary novel. This dug me out of some of my financial trouble, and along with some help of a banker that I met along the way, I declared bankruptcy, got out of my debts, and had enough money to build a small mansion which I called Stormfield in Redding, Connecticut. I spent my time in Stormfield to the end of my life. But my last successful novel I wrote in 1894. It was called A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. You see, it's about a man who lives in Connecticut, much like I did, who goes back in time and uses his modern knowledge as an engineer to impress the people of King Arthur's day, convince them that he's a wizard. Now, silly as this sounds, it did bring in quite a bit of revenue and allowed me to live comfortably for the rest of my life. But tragedy struck when I least expected it, and first I lost my wife Olivia when she was only 64. Then my youngest daughter Susie, died of spinal meningitis, and my oldest daughter passed away. My middle daughter, Jean Clemens, did outlive me, but we were distant because I was often on lectures or tours, and she was at home taking care of her own family at this point. I finally passed away in 1910 of a heart attack. Before I go, I would have liked to show you some pictures, but fortunately this modern doodad ain't working, so I guess I'll have to leave you with this. Thank you for allowing me to share with you my story. I hope you all had a good time. See you later.